Welcome once more. Let's bring you up to speed on developments from and regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First off, Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Tehran for scheduled talks with President Ibrahim Raisi and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan. The official purpose of the visit is to discuss the situation in Syria, though the talks are also expected to address the impact of the war in Ukraine, particularly its effect on grain exports. We'll have more on this in just a few minutes. And speaking of grains, the Kremlin says Russia expects talks on the safe passage for Ukrainian grain shipments via the Black Sea to continue in the near future. Government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says Russia is willing to do its best to ensure that Ukrainian grain can reach global markets. Turkey said on Monday that officials from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and the United Nations are expected to meet later this week to discuss the issue, which the UN says is contributing to a global food crisis. The European Commission has proposed spending $512 million to finance joint defense purchases among member states to replenish weapons stocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European Commissioner Terry Breton says EU countries have drawn on their stocks of ammunition, light and heavy artillery, anti-aircraft and anti-tank defense systems, and even armored vehicles and tanks. And the mayor of Ukraine's Donbass region of Donetsk says a Russian missile has hit the center of the city of Kramatorsk. Now, he revealed this on Facebook, saying there were casualties without any more details. Let's take out from today's attacks. We are aware of so far that firefighters in Odesa have been battling to contain a number of fires in the aftermath of a Russian missile strike on the city, in which at least 4 people were injured. Ukrainian authorities say Russian forces have intensified long-distance strikes on targets far from the front, killing large numbers of civilians. Moscow insists it is hitting only military targets. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces have fired more than 3,000 cruise missiles and uncountable artillery shells during the 5-month conflict. Just yesterday, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu ordered generals to prioritize destroying Ukraine's long-range missile and artillery weapons after strikes on Russian supply lines. And even today, when Sergei Shoigu announced that Russian forces have destroyed ammunition depots in the southern Odesa region that were storing weapons supplied to Kyiv by the United States and the European countries, he, however, did not say how many depots it had destroyed or what weapons were being stored there. Well, Ukraine continues to train new civilian volunteers to help fight against Russian forces, as the country claims to have a total of 1 million in its armed forces and aims to recapture the Russian-controlled south regions. A group of civilian volunteers have recently joined Ukraine's territorial defense, which is operating together with the army against Russia. During a regular training day in a forest near Bucha, these volunteer fighters were going through the ambush training. Surprising the Russians from behind in order to neutralize their commanders has proven effective so far. The training required for this, however, had to be drastically cut short. Colonel of Ukraine's territorial defense, Andriy Syuba, says normal education takes about 2 to 3 months, but he says we don't have much time. That's why we had to reduce it so that the group will be ready in just about 4 weeks. But a significant part of this alleged million is already involved in defending the remaining Donbass territory and could not be used in any counteroffensive. Nevertheless, the country's military is optimistic. Anti-Ukrainian parliament, which has voted to dismiss the country's SBU chief, that's Ukraine's security agency, and the country's prosecutor general 2 days after they were fired by President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying they had failed to root out employees collaborating with Russia. Hours after announcing their dismissals, President Zelensky said investigations have begun on personnel in the SBU. The careers of SBU Security Service Chief Ivan Bakanov and Prosecutor General Irina Venediktova had personified Zelensky's policy of putting young loyalists in charge of fighting corruption since the former TV comic came to power in 2019. But nearly 5 months after Russia's invasion, the president acknowledged that his two allies had failed to root out traitors and collaborators in the organizations. In his regular nightly address, he mentioned that a personnel audit of the security service was taking place and the issue of the dismissal of 28 officials was being considered.
Питання щодо звільнення 28 посадовців.
One more important piece of news regarding the security service of Ukraine. A personnel audit of the security service is taking place. The issue of the dismissal of 28 officials is being considered from different levels in different directions, but the grounds are similar: unsatisfactory job performance. The armed forces of our state have managed to inflict significant logistical losses on the occupiers. It is getting increasingly harder for the Russian army to hold its positions in the occupied territory. Step by step, we advance, breaking the occupiers' supply lines, detecting and neutralizing collaborators. The perspective is evident. The Ukrainian flag will be in all our cities and villages. It is only a question of time.
Well, we had mentioned this earlier. President Vladimir Putin in Iran for talks with President Ibrahim Raisi and Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. Iranian political analyst Mohammed Malandi says Iran and Russia will seek to reach consensus with Turkey on regional situation, including issues surrounding Syria, and strengthen economic and trade cooperation at an upcoming meeting among the three countries. At the talks, Iran and Russia are expected to discuss the issues with Turkey in the hope that the Turkish side will reconsider its stance on Syria. Malandi said that in the context of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, coupled with the increasing sanctions on Russia from the US, both Russia, which is being sanctioned, and Turkey, which is facing economic difficulties, are more willing to strengthen cooperation with Iran. Therefore, he says that seeking wider economic and trade cooperation will be another important topic high on the agenda of the meeting. The trilateral summit is coming after US President Joe Biden on Saturday wrapped up his first trip to the Middle East since taking office, with a lukewarm response from regional countries.
Iran and Russia both oppose the Turkish policy in Syria, and they believe it creates a threat to regional stability and global stabilities. So the Russians and the Iranians want to convince the Turks that they have to rethink their foreign policy. And there are ways that they are thinking about engaging with Turks in order to help bring about that change. Russians want to quickly complete the north-south corridor so that the Russians can trade from Iran into the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. That would be a great benefit to the Russians, and they can export their grain and other goods through Iran. The countries in the region recognize that the United States is not the power that it was before. It's more, I don't want to say it's an empty shell, but it's definitely not what it was a decade or 2 decades or especially 3 decades ago. So for the Iranians, this trip was a major failure.
Meanwhile, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has stressed the importance of maintaining Syria's territorial integrity. He was speaking at a joint news conference with Turkish President. Both leaders held talks in the Iranian capital ahead of the trilateral summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Turkey, which has mounted 4 operations in northern Syria since 2016, has vowed to launch more military operations to extend 30-kilometer deep safe zones along the border. Any Turkish operation in Syria would attack the Kurdish YPG militia, a key part of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, that controls large parts of North Syria and is regarded by Washington as an important ally against Islamic State. Ukraine's First Lady Olena Zelensky has met with Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, Samantha Power, in the United States. It's been a while the First Lady has been seen in public. She was accompanied by Ukrainian Ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Makarova. Ms. Power affirmed the U.S.'s unwavering support for a sovereign, democratic and prosperous Ukraine, free and secure in its internationally recognized borders. During their meeting, Ms. Powers emphasized that the U.S. remains committed to Ukraine's long-term recovery and development, while also working to meet the urgent humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people. Both women discussed the immediate escalating healthcare needs in Ukraine, a tragic result of Russia's invasion. They both agreed that Ukraine and its international partners must continue to balance responding to urgent priorities with planning for the country's future recovery. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says Washington will discuss with South Korea measures to limit revenues flowing to Russia, such as price cap on its oil, while the allies work to curb North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. In a speech prepared for a meeting with the South Korean counterpart, Chu Kyun-ho, Yellen said the two would explore a price cap to reduce oil earnings and other ways of holding Russia accountable for its war against Ukraine. Earlier in the day, Yellen also held separate meetings with South Korean President, during which she said the U.S. will impose harsh consequences on countries that break the international economic order.
Now contributing to the stable supply.
The United States and Republic of Korea continue to work in lockstep to limit North Korea's continued development and proliferation of its nuclear and missile programs. Russia's illegal war and the global energy shock that is followed underscores the need to protect ourselves from dependence on foreign oil that makes us vulnerable to the whims of authoritarians like Vladimir Putin.
Joining me for more on the war in Ukraine is Michelle Agatishe, a legal practitioner and foreign affairs analyst. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me on the program. I'd like to begin. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Iran for only his second foreign trip since he launched the invasion of Ukraine in February. How important do you think is this contact with Iran at this time?
Well, thank you very much, Millicent, for having me. I think that it's quite important because this is a time where the international community has tried to more or less utilize, basically making Russia a pariah nation as one of the ways to win the war in Ukraine. Now, seeing that Russia is still on the table, and not only on the table, a significant power broker in that region, of course, will, send alarm bells ringing, particularly in Washington. But just to say, though, that in terms of the impact for this war, I do not see that to be so significant. And the reason is simple. Prior to the Ukraine war was the issue in Syria. And the primary focus of this trilateral meeting between Iran, Turkey, and Russia is Syria on the agenda, issues relating to how Turkey is going to deal with potentially expanding the safety zone. As you would recall, Turkey backs the rebels, whereas Iran backs the Syrian government. So those are the critical issues. So despite the fact that the Ukraine matter will come up, the impact it would have, I don't see to be so significant, because despite the fact of the Ukraine war, Russia still remains a critical player in resolving the conflict in Syria, which has also dragged on for almost a decade now.
Many have wondered what, they might conclude, and this is saying the re-emergence of these three countries, Russia, Turkey, Iran, many wonder what could be the alliance, especially now, considering the positions that, these countries are taking, and this is concerning the war in Ukraine. U.S. officials accusing Tehran planning to supply Russia with drones, and then we have the role Turkey is playing with supplying Ukraine, of course, drones, combat drones to the Ukrainian military.
Yes, I mean, it's a very interesting time in world geopolitics, if I could say so. And why that's also very interesting is the fact that prior to the arrival of Putin yesterday, Recep Erdogan and the leader of Iran entered into a 20-year bilateral agreement wherein they agreed to even upscale bilateral trade between the two countries to, I believe, about $35 billion. Now, that is inherently problematic for the other side of the international divide. Why? Because Iran, as we would all recall, prior to the Ukraine war, was the pariah nation. And Turkey, on the other hand, is a member of NATO. And in fact, recently, despite the fact that Recep Erdogan had acceded to, Finland and Finland joining NATO, further even stated a couple of days ago that, look, they can still decide not to accede to that in Parliament. So I don't see the end goal here. But I definitely see that this is something that is going to signal alarm bells and also feeds into that conversation about a new world order, particularly when you look at the increasing cooperation, for example, between Russia and China. So if you bring Iran into the mix, Iran, who is also a major supplier of oil and gas, and we understand what's going on in the oil and gas space, particularly as it relates to increased, prices of everything really in Europe. Right, in terms of food security. So it's almost like that kind of conversation or that kind of statement from Russia saying that, well, you can't get me out of the game. You can't take my significance away. And your trade bites aren't hurting me. Try harder.
Exactly. Extremely keen to show that the international sanctions have failed to isolate it. But are friends sticking around? Does Russia have any friends at this time?
Well, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that they have friends. I would just say that certain interests are still superseding, right, concerted international efforts to stop the Ukraine war. And that, of course, is as a result of, Russia's behemoth role that they play, particularly in the energy space, and how important energy is to many economies. There are some significant economies that are still trading and dealing with Russia almost as normal. You have India, which is one of the biggest economies in the world at the moment. You have China, who has a bilateral relationship with Russia that was signed after the invasion of Ukraine, and a relationship that we basically stated in the text of those documents that it is a friendship with no limits. You have Iran, who is still looking to Russia as a broker in terms of dealing with Turkey. And of course, you also have Turkey, which to some are saying that, well, even though they seem on the face of it to be supporting Ukraine, for many, they have also questioned how far they really are going. So I think it's a situation of almost power blocks, if you may. What I fear is us going back to what we had pre-1990s, before, Gorbachev and everything, where you had, a clear distinction in the world, during the Cold War, where you had those who followed the path of Russia and those who had the path of USA. Why? What could then potentially happen is a situation where you have micro wars in different smaller states. And as we all know from the African saying, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers.
Somewhat, some BFF still exists in geopolitics. In terms of this meeting, they're also going to be looking at grain exports from Ukraine. There are allegations that, Russia is shelling that and preventing that passage. Do you think that Turkey can broker a tentative agreement between Russia and Ukraine leaders?
Well, I would hope that they will be able to broker some. I understand that even aside from Turkey, even those in some of the Western countries are also trying to broker some form of agreement. And I think this is something that is particularly important even for us that live in Africa, for example. A lot of the grain that comes into Africa comes from Ukraine. They're one of the largest producers of wheat, etc. Now, to the extent that the port of Odesa remains blockaded, we might have a real situation of excessive famine, right? And we will then be a byproduct of the war, even though we have for most of it being an innocent bystander. So even though I cannot say whether in fact the Turks will be able to broker some sort of palliative deal, if I may use that word, I would hope for it, for the best interest of even us who are right across each other on the screen.
Indeed, and the larger population. We appreciate your time. Thank you. It was a pleasure having you join us. Mitchell Agatishe is a legal practitioner and foreign affairs analyst. Thank you again.
Millicent, it's always my pleasure. Thank you very much.